So now let's talk a little bit about what we read in the McGrath book on models for doing theology in science. And a really great starting point for that discussion is Ian Barber's 4 models of the relationship between theology and science. And these models are, much talked about and in the literature, and there's a lot of discussion about whether they are really adequate, whether there are other models that should be added, but more or less this kind of modeling is recognized as a useful rubric. And one thing you also want to think about with these models is Barber himself isn't saying that all of the different kinds of relationship between theology and science fall neatly into any one box, and in fact that in any particular theorist's approach to doing theology and science, there may be places where different aspects of these different models might apply at the same time or at different times. So here is 4 models: conflict or warfare. And we have talked about this a little already, the idea that it must be the case that theology and science are always going to be in conflict or at war with each other. Another model is independence. And in some of the publications of the National Academy of Sciences in the US, this is a model that is promoted. And the idea here is that there are, in a phrase used by some philosophers in the area, that there are non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, that science has its domain of authority and of understanding, and theology may have its domain of authority and understanding. But those two domains are separate. They don't overlap. They don't intervene in any way with each other. And you can see how this can be a useful way sometimes to approach things. It avoids the possibility of conflict and warfare. And the problem, of course, is that it also assumes that neither of the disciplines have anything to say to each other. And in practice, it often tends to then relativize the theological domain to a domain of maybe feeling or of certain kind of way that some people simply choose to structure their lives without having any broader necessary connection to a broader kind of truth. A third model is the dialogue model. And among many people working in theology and science, this is one preferred approach. And so the idea here is that there is a degree to which theology and the natural sciences do have some independence. They are speaking to different domains, different ways of knowing, different cultural domains, but they can dialogue with each other and speak to each other. And in that dialogue and speaking to each other, they can learn some things from each other. And you'll often hear that, the natural sciences are about facts, and theology or philosophy might be about values. And, the facts of what the natural sciences establish can inform values, and values can inform the way that the natural sciences go about their business. So that's one example of dialogue. So this can be a useful model. And then a fourth bucket is a model of integration. And the idea here is that it goes beyond mere dialogue, but where theology can actually inform scientific facts and science can inform theology. So there's sort of a broader possibility of more fundamental change within both disciplines. And one area where this is popular among some theology and science practitioners is in the area, again, of philosophy of mind or of soul or of spirit. So how does neuroscience tell us about the nature of our spirituality, and how does our spirituality affect the neural chemistry of our brains? So all of these are possible models, and as I said, we don't necessarily have to think of them as separate buckets. It might be that a given scholar might employ aspects of each of these in different instances. So, for example, if you do look at my chapter on theology and method in theology and science in my recent book, I certainly don't want a fundamental conflict or warfare model. and I certainly don't want a fundamental independence model. I lean more toward the dialogue model. I'm wary of the integration model when it results in things like process theology, which seem to me to compromise some basic convictions that I want to assert in theology. But there are places where I think at least assertions of the natural sciences come into at least apparent conflict with some theological truth. There are places in which I do think it's useful to understand the different methods and areas that each is dealing with. There are places where I do think some degree of integration is appropriate, even as I'm primarily looking at a dialogue kind of model. McGrath offers his own approach in his chapter that I also think is helpful and does inform some of the ways I think about it. So, McGrath is kind of looking at perspectives or levels of reality. So his first two, different perspective on reality or different maps of reality. So you could say that science and theology are looking at the same large areas of truth, but they're looking at it from somewhat different angles. They're seeing somewhat different facets of the same truth. You could look at it in terms of a map, and I'll show you here. So here's Google Maps of northern New Jersey where I live, and there's a common saying in sort of literary theory that I really appreciate: the map is not the territory. So this is a map; it is not the actual ground on which we walk. And in fact, we look at this layer of this map, and it is showing us, for example, the streets that are in this area, and it's a reasonably accurate representation of the streets in this area. And if we link it to a GPS, it'll get us where we want to go. We could add another layer. Let's say we want to see the restaurants in the area. Well, let's add a layer of restaurants. We can add another layer of the supermarkets in the area, for example. We can add a geographical layer and show some of the geographical features. And so what we could is similarly, we could say that the natural sciences are showing one perceptual layer. It is not the whole of reality, it is one layer of it, like the street grid. And theology is showing some other layers. It's not the whole of reality, but it's one layer of it. So that's a useful metaphor. Similarly, McGrath talks about distinct levels of reality. And here he is getting at this idea of function and meaning. Now, this is getting into a way that McGrath and many other theorists in theology and science approach things, which is the idea of critical realism. So the idea that there is a real basic physical level of reality, and upon that are built other levels of reality, levels of meaning. One way that I might illustrate this, I teach in my law school, I teach classes in cybersecurity and internet law. And in doing that, it's really helpful to talk about the different layers of a communication system. And we can really simplify it to 3 layers, which is a hardware layer, a software or code layer, and a content layer. So the hardware layer is the cables and routers and switches that make up the physical components of the internet. The code layer are the protocols and software that allow different devices to communicate with each other, and the content layer is the actual communication. So as I'm delivering this course to you through videos, right, it's coming through cables that are going into your home. There is software that's allowing the video to be encoded in a certain way that your computer can read it, and there are ideas that I'm communicating as content. And those are different levels or layers of the communication system. And so similarly, you could say there's a physical world. There's information, genetic information, for example. And then there's other sorts of communication, other sorts of intentionality that emerges and develops out of that. All right, and then a fourth model McGrath mentions is a complementary approach to reality called the two books model. And this has been very important historically, and next week when we talk about the history, we'll get into this a little bit more. But you can say that in Scripture and in Revelation is one book of God's speech to us, and creation itself is a book of God's speech to us. In both of these two books, God is telling us things about reality in the world we live in and about himself. Each book might have a different theme, each book may have a different approach, but ultimately these two books read together. And so another way of thinking about it is this two books approach. Now, I want to suggest that this whole lecture that we've just been going through is getting at some really big related questions. And I think it's important in considering the way to think about the relationship between theology and science and different models for doing it, and many of the specific questions that we'll be getting into throughout our learning community together, to keep in mind these big related questions. I feel like I'm confident that both on the side of the natural sciences and on the side of some religious people, it's losing sight of the interrelatedness of these big questions that often leads to conflict. So we have epistemology. Epistemology in philosophical terms is what human beings can know, if anything, and how human beings know, if in fact they know anything. And then there is ontology, which is the nature of things, specific things and general things. And then there is metaphysics, which is the overarching model or thought about what is or what could be. And all of these things will relate to each other. And if you're thinking ultimately consistently, you're going to have an epistemology, a theory of what you know or what humans know or what they can know, if anything, that's going to relate to an ontology, the nature of things and what things are. And that an ontology in turn is going to relate to a metaphysics, what is or what could be. And we want to kind of try and really inquire, I would suggest always, about whenever we're talking about a model or an argument or an assertion in the relationship of theology and science. Well, what is it you're claiming that is known or could be known, and how? What are the methods that you're using for knowledge, for example? What are you suggesting about ontology? What is the nature of things, and why are you suggesting a certain nature of things? And what are you assuming or asserting about metaphysics? What is or what could be? And there are lots of different ways we could discuss this, but I want to offer a few thoughts to conclude this video about ways of thinking about these things that are related and that often come into theology and science discussions. So one could be a kind of naive or common sense realism. I see something in front of me. I see my water bottle in front of me. And since I see it and pick it up and drink some water, my common sense tells me there is something called a water bottle. There is something called water. These have a real existence. There is a real universe, all of that. Well, maybe there's some validity to that, but it is fairly naive. How do I know? How do I know that, in fact, this is, for example, real and not just a simulation? Another is positivism. And positivism is a very modern kind of approach that really in philosophy has largely been discredited. There are still some logical positivists out there, but really not a primary model anymore in philosophy. Although I suggest, as I did before, that among many who assert some kind of conflict in theology and science on the side of science are really asserting a kind of logical positivism. Well, on the side of theology or religion are often asserting a naive or common sense realism. So positivism is the idea that all that can be known is through logical reasoning and argument based on some relatively narrow grammatical rules. And so you can see how that would lend itself to really excluding a lot of other kinds of phenomena as valid sources of knowledge. So, for example, intuition or certain aspects of emotion could be excluded. Pragmatism is, I think, really kind of almost a reigning paradigm in parts of our culture, which is simply that what counts as knowledge is what is useful. So I have my water bottle here. I know that I'm thirsty. This thing holds water. It allows me to drink some water. Now I can kind of set aside what is the nature of water? What is the nature? Is this really something real? Is it a simulation? Is there some deeper philosophical sense of what water is? I can just set that aside because I know I'm thirsty and I take a drink. Again, really useful, a sort of rich tradition of thinking about pragmatism. In my view, ultimately inadequate because it simply sets aside what I think are the really important questions of meaning and value. Anti-Realism. So there are philosophers of science who are anti-realist, who do not think that it's possible to establish that what we perceive is actually real, and who in fact think there are good arguments that what we perceive is not real. Just in the newspaper this week, I saw that a very well-known philosopher of science, David Chalmers, has published a book and is talking a lot about the possibility and in his view, the likelihood that we all are living in a computer simulation like the Matrix, that what we think is naively real is not. It's an interesting thought experiment. Of course, this isn't, well, I shouldn't say of course, but this isn't a view that I hold. But there are serious philosophers who hold a view like this. Critical realism, I mentioned before, is what many theologians in the theology and science discussion would gravitate towards. Someone like Alistair McGrath gravitates toward critical realism. And the idea here is that there is a real universe. It does have real regularities. When we are studying something like the water in the water bottle, we're getting at something about reality. But that we as human beings, we are limited. Our perceptions are limited. We do have a real ability to know, but our knowledge is limited. It's always possible that our knowledge is defeasible. In other words, that we think we know some things that in fact turn out to be inaccurate. And so we always have to be kind of critically assessing what we are thinking about reality. And further, that reality does have levels or layers. And you see that in McGrath's model, that yes, I can describe the water in my bottle as H2O. I can describe its property of, nourishing, hydrating me. I also can talk about the social meaning of water, how it relates to poverty and political disputes and all sorts of things like that are aspects of what we mean. All right, and then another, and I'll just for this purpose, final bucket is idealism. So idealism is the notion that that ideas, the mental, is in fact more real than the physical, and that the physical has its own reality, but the reality of the physical is in some sense dependent on the reality of the mental. Now, in next week, when we start to talk about the history of theology and science, I'm going to get into this a bit more when we talk about Plato's theory of the forms, and then about how Plato's theory of the forms influenced early Christian thought. Personally, I think idealism doesn't get quite enough play in some of the Anglo-American theology and science dialogue. It gets more play, I think, in some aspects of some European approaches. This gets into some weeds about philosophy and the difference between Anglo-American analytic philosophy and continental European continental philosophy. We don't have to get into all those weeds, but just realize there's sort of this critical realism model that is very popular among many theology and science folks. And then there are some who also want to draw on idealism. Ultimately, I would suggest, and I suggest this in my chapter in my book, that the distinctions here are relatively small, that they're really more distinctions in kind of a sort of spirit or ethos or approach to things than fundamentally a difference in the meaning of things. But that's something we can talk about as we go on. So these are some of the models and ways of approaching the scientific method, philosophy of science, and the relationship between theology and science, and the kind of questions ultimately we're really trying to ask.